Welcome, folks. If you were with us for episode 1, you already know we're digging into a story that's both heartbreaking and haunting. It's an unsolved tragedy that's loomed over Fulton for 25 years. Now, in episode 1, we met Leiland Cannon. From his joyful childhood to his service in the Navy to his beautiful family, he built a reputation that was defined by kindness and generosity. So let me briefly remind you of other important key details we covered in the first episode. These are details that make this case dark and chilling. There was $50,000 in cash withdrawn by Leland and kept in a briefcase by his favorite chair. But after the murder, that briefcase is gone. The other valuables, like a beautiful $30,000 ring, that was still on his finger, and $1,000 sitting in an open safe, that was untouched. And then there was that ledger. Now, it was a simple notebook, but it tracked the loans that Leland gave to those in need. It was left behind. Was that a clue? So if you missed episode 1, go back and listen, because it's important to understand the horrific details of this case. Because everything changed on that January 12th in 2000. Something shattered the peace of a small Ohio town and left a family desperate for answers. Sometime between 6:30 p.m. and midnight, Leland's life was stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. Fulton was quiet and still in the dead of winter, and that would have made any unusual sound like, say, a car, voices, or footsteps sound louder, amplified. But no one saw or heard anything, or if they did, they stayed quiet. If the killer was local, they would have known how to blend in, right? How to move unnoticed in the stillness of the night. And if they weren't, their presence might have been far more obvious, stuck out more. Well, let's explore how it unfolded and why we're still searching for answers. There was Leland, tucked away, warm and dry, in his house, and the one his father, Elmo, had bought when he was a kid. Now that home, the one he grew up in, the one that always stood as a safe place of warmth and kindness, was about to become the unthinkable. A crime scene. A car pulls up quietly on Axine Avenue. The night is cold, dark, and still. The perfect cover for someone intent on doing harm. Did they sit in the car for a moment, gathering their nerves, scanning the street for any signs of life? Or was their mind already made up, every detail already planned out? They get out, their breath visible in the freezing night air. The crunch of their footsteps on the frosty ground is muffled and cautious. They move quickly, but deliberately, toward Leland's house. I wonder if the door was locked, or did they simply just turn the knob to get in? I wonder if they knocked first, pretending to be someone Leland knew, or they just walked in fully aware that they were going to catch poor Leland off guard. And then they're inside, and what happens next is hard to imagine. Did Leland try to reason with him? His natural kindness automatically kicking in. At some point, the killer's focus shifted. Now, they weren't just there to hurt Leland. They wanted something they were willing to kill for. The attack, the crime was over quickly and violently, and Leland, a man who had spent his entire life offering support to others, was left on the floor of his den to pass away alone. And the killers, well, they walked out the same way they went in, disappearing into the night as if they vanished without a trace. But they left behind more than just a crime scene. They left behind trauma and tragedy. So who could walk into Leland's home, take his life with such viciousness, and then disappear into the night as if they were never there? Well, today we're picking up where we left off in episode 1. We're going to dive deeper into investigation, and we're going to look into the suspects and the questions that so haunt us all. But before we get into all of that, let's take a moment to remember what this story is really about, folks. I had an amazing conversation with Leland's son, Dan, and let me tell you, it was filled with laughter and tears, and good tears, because we talked about who Leland was, the kind of man he was, and the memories that still bring light even after all this darkness. Dan may have been Leland's stepson, but you would never know it by the way Leland treated him. To Leland, family was just family. There were no steps or no halves or nothing like that, just unconditional love and care. Leland was a WW2 vet, and he was raised on principles like God, family, and country. Do unto others. You know, your name is your word, and a handshake is just like a contract. He was one of those sweet souls who wouldn't hurt a fly. And I mean that literally. Dan told me that if Leland saw something like a spider in the house, they'd carefully catch it and let it loose outside. While talking with Dan, I felt like I'd met the Cannon family in spirit, because I have no doubt in my mind that Leland is looking down, bursting with pride at the legacy this family continues to carry forward today. So let's get back to where everything changed. What happened that awful night? And why, after all these years, is this case still unsolved? January 13th began like any ordinary day in East Fultonham, a small town where life moved quiet and slow. But by mid-morning, that calm had shattered. Whispers spread like wildfire, carrying a weight that hung heavy over the community. Leiland Cannon, a man everyone knew, respected, and admired, was gone, brutally murdered in his own home. It wasn't just shocking, it was devastating, like a punch to the gut for everyone who had ever crossed paths with him. Neighbors stood in their doorways, exchanging stunned glances, their heads shaking in disbelief. How could this happen to someone like Leland? When investigators arrived at this home, they knew they were walking into a scene that demanded caution and care. Every step they took and every piece of evidence they encountered had to be carefully examined. This wasn't just a devastation. It was a killing that needed answers, and they were determined to find them. The first step for the investigators was to carefully walk through Leland's home, observing the scene without disturbing any potential evidence. Now, at first glance, it might have looked like a sudden medical emergency, something tragic but natural. I mean, after all, Leland was 74 years old. Maybe he had fallen or suffered a heart attack. But the closer they looked, the clearer it became. This was something far darker. The scene wasn't saying accident. It was screaming a murder. The blood splatter told a gruesome story. The defensive wound spoke volumes. The body was their first clue. It spoke loudly to the investigators. And they would have to start asking about Leland's day-to-day life, his habits, routines, anything that seemed out of ordinary recently. They'd have to dig into his relationships and his finances, and especially that missing briefcase. But back at the crime scene, whoever entered that house, they wasn't searching in desperation because there were no overturned drawers, no flipped mattresses, none of that mess you'd expect in a burglary like that. This was methodical, targeted. And Leland's pockets had been turned inside out, like someone was searching for something specific. Other clues helped the investigators move toward robbery as a motive. It wasn't about ransacking the house for whatever they could grab. This was about one thing, finding that money. And as we continue walking through the chilling details of this crime, the picture gets even more unsettling. Folks, I need to issue a trigger warning here. We're about to dive into the details of the case. I want you to know what these evil, heartless people did to a defenseless, elderly old man who didn't deserve this. I want you to feel the pain, the disgust, and yes, absolutely, the anger at what they did to him. Because here's the thing, folks. If they had just asked for help, if they would have just grabbed it and ran, Leland would have given it to them. That's the kind of man he was. Okay, so when detectives arrived at Leland's home that morning, they walked into a nightmare, a scene that would leave a lasting mark on both the investigators and the whole county. Leland's body lay face down in the TV room. That was a place that he always relaxed in. It was a comfort room for him. But this morning, it was anything but. Blood splattered across all four walls of the den, its pattern speaking louder than words. Now, I've been thinking about that, and I felt it could be a clue, because it went from right to left. Could this mean that there was more than one attacker, too, because it was on all four walls? I don't know. It's just something to think about. Around Leland's head, blood pooled heavily, adding to the grim reality of the scene. Now, that was where a majority of the trauma was to his skull. But what truly unnerved the investigators was the heat. See, the house temperature had been cranked way up over 80, far warmer than Leland would have kept it. Now, why would somebody do that? I mean, it was on purpose. I think it's another clue, because turning up the heat speeds up decomp. and that makes it harder to pinpoint the exact time of death. And Leland's injuries told a story of violence so extreme it was hard to fathom. His skull bore deep circular fractures, and this wound exposed matter, and matter was found on his upper pant leg. But that wasn't all. His body bore sharp cuts and gashes. Now, this wasn't from a knife, but something capable of slicing and tearing as well and crushing. Those are all clues as to what type of weapon or weapons were used. And I'm wondering, was it a weapon of opportunity or something chosen just for this specific act? Well, no weapon has ever been found. In total, Leland's body revealed 42 marks of blunt force trauma. That's 42 moments of imaginable pain. His ribs were shattered, and defensive wounds were on his hands, and that told a heartbreaking story of a man who fought back, who tried to defend himself against an attacker or attackers, and they were hell-bent on ending his life. But just hours earlier, life seemed normal. Leland's cleaning lady, Laura Thomas, she was the last person to see him alive. She left his home at 6:35 the night before. Now, they had plans to meet the next morning at Canning Printing Company. But when Leland didn't show up, Laura began to worry. And it was his son, Cecil, who ultimately discovered the horror. Walking into the home, expecting to find his father, he instead found a scene of chaos and bloodshed that no family member should ever have to see. The evidence, the defensive wounds, the blood patterns, the sheer brutality of the assault all point to one truth. This was a targeted attack. But then there's another piece of the puzzle that refuses to fade, a shadowy lead that's hung in the air for decades, and we've not mentioned it before. Let's talk about one of the most frustrating and intriguing pieces of this case, the suspicious car spotted outside Leland's home the night of his murder. Leland's daughter, Johanna, she recalls seeing a small to medium-sized car, and it was parked near the house. It was the new models for the time, probably a model from 1996 to 2000. And the color was hard to say exactly, dark green, blue, or black, because the street light nearby distorted things that night, and it made it tough to pinpoint the color, but it was a dark color. And what stood out the most to Johanna was the car didn't belong there. She didn't recognize it, neither did the neighbors. It was definitely out of place. Now, here's where things get interesting. See, Johanna, she isn't just any casual observer. She knows her cars. She's worked on them for years and notices details most of us would overlook. Now, she remembers the taillights clear as day. This is another clue. Now, these taillights had a circle or a half circle design that stuck with her ever since. And after her father's murder, she even tracked down similar examples to match what she saw, and she sketched them out. We're going to share those on our Facebook group so you can see for yourself. Also, this is very interesting. Under hypnosis, Johanna recalled part of the license plate. Yeah, it's AMC 440. We'll have that on the Facebook group too. And she's confident the plate's county sticker started with an M, but not Muskingum. She thinks it was possibly Morgan, Monroe, or Morrow, something like that. The car was parked on Axine Avenue side of Leland's house, and it was between 9:40 and 10:10 p.m. on January 12, 2000. That's the exact time frame we think that the murder happened. And here's what's odd. This wasn't a usual spot for visitors to park when coming to Leland's home. Johanna's gut told her something just wasn't right, and I'd trust her instinct. But here's the part that really gets me. If the driver of that car was innocent, why didn't they come forward? Why the silence after all these years? Are they hiding something? This car could be the missing piece. A vehicle with specific taillights and a partial plate and a questionable presence at the scene. Who was driving it? Why were they there? For Johanna, these questions have haunted her for 25 years. We're going to take a short break now, but stick with us. We're far from done piecing the story together. Okay, we're back. We've gone over the chilling and planned details of Leland's murder, the missing briefcase, the ledger, the crime scene, and all the questions that have lingered ever since. The crime scene offered us some chilling clues: blood spatter patterns, turned out pockets, and the heat turned up. Maybe there were two weapons. This all was hinting at a calculated and violent act with a clear motive. Now it's time to shift our focus to the people rumored to be tied to this case. In every crime case, there's names, people whose connections to the victim raises red flags, people investigators have to look at more closely. And in Leland's case, we're zeroing in on 4 individuals. Some had troubled pasts, others had whisperous connections, and all of them stand out for one reason or another. These aren't just names on a list. They're threads in a larger web that's avoided Leland's family and our community for 25 long years. This case may lack a clear suspect, but we're not short on persons of interest. Let's go ahead and we're going to dive into the stories. Now let's talk about the last person to see Leland alive and our first person of interest, and that's his cleaning lady, Laura Thomas. Now, she left his home at 6:35 p.m. on January 12th. That was just hours before his murder. But Laura wasn't just an employee. See, her relationship with Leland, it kind of blurred the line. Now, they had an arrangement for some adult fun on the side, and that was their business, absolutely, but it was something the investigators had to consider carefully. This wasn't just someone tidying up his home. Laura, well, she might have known more about Leland's personal life than most people would have thought. She definitely knew about the ledger. But what about the briefcase? I mean, it was sitting right there in plain sight. Did she know about the $50,000 inside? And if she did, who else might she have shared that information with? I know these are tough questions, but they're the kind we need to ask. This isn't about casting judgment of any kind. It's about understanding who Laura associated with. I mean, who was her circle? What kind of friends or family did she have? Could someone she know have seen an opportunity to take advantage of Leland's trust? But here's where it gets complicated. See, Laura passed away a few years ago, and that makes getting these answers really harder, probably even impossible. But her closeness to Leland's life and the timing of her last visit, it just makes her someone to question. Was Laura simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or could her connection to Leland may have been the thread that led others to this terrible crime? It's just something to think about. Okay, so our second person of interest is Leland's own son, Lee. Now, he was described by family members as eccentric and cold. Lee allegedly had a strained relationship with his father at the time of the murder. And when I started digging into the details, a lot of red flags began to surface. One moment that stands out is what happened the day after Leland's murder. So allegedly, Lee's wife, Judy, decided to wash a load of Leland's clothes. Now, on the surface, that might not seem like a big deal. But here's the thing. Judy had never cared for Leland's laundry or his house or him before. So why the sudden interest in cleaning these clothes after his death? And let's ask the obvious question. I mean, why would Leland need clean clothes now at this point? I mean, a funeral requires a suit, not freshly washed casual wear. Then there's the polygraph situation. See, the family was asked to take lie detector tests, and most of them passed. But Lee didn't. He failed the first test. The second test came back inconclusive, and Judy simply refused to take another one after she failed her first attempt. Now, these results, combined with the behavior, that just left the family members uneasy for years. And let's talk about Lee's history with his own mother. Allegedly, when his mother was dying, Lee dropped her off at the hospital while he was in the process of moving out of state. Allegedly, he never came back, never called, not even when she passed away just a few days later. It was the hospital staff who had to track down Lee's ex-stepmom, remember that's Leland's ex, Nancy? They contacted her to find a family member. Now just let that sink in a moment. That just blew my mind. If Lee could treat his own mother this way, it's no wonder family members have questions what he might have been capable of doing to his father that he didn't get along with, and especially if $50,000 is on the line. Now, let's just be clear. Lee is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, and so is Judy, and she passed away a few years ago. But in cases like this, investigators always start by looking at the people closest to the victim. And Lee's name just kept coming up. He doesn't have a criminal record or a history of violence of any kind. But let's be honest, you never really know when or if someone is capable of snapping. Let's talk about our third person of interest, Jeremy McGilton. This name has hung around Leland's case from the very beginning, like smoke that refuses to clear. It keeps creeping back, bringing with it the same questions and doubts. Jeremy's story is one of escalating crime, violence, and missed opportunities to turn his life around. By the time he was just 19, Jeremy's rap sheet read like a roadmap to disaster. He had aggravated trespassing, assaults, burglaries, and a string of drug charges. His path wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. 7 months after Leland's murder, Jeremy was sentenced to 4 years in prison for burglary. But here's the thing. If he had had a cut of the $50,000 that vanished with Leland's briefcase, why was he out committing burglaries now? Well, I think, folks, heavy drug use and reckless spending might explain it. By October 2000, maybe the money was long gone. Then in 2005, Jeremy's crimes escalated to something far worse. That year, his name made national headlines. Jeremy was arrested for a brutal home invasion murder in South Carolina. A fight over a laptop ended with a young man, James Young, shot and killed. This wasn't just a crime. It was downright evil. And Jeremy wasn't acting alone. He had 3 accomplices, including Ross Swelling. This is another name tied to Leland's case, and Ryan Robb, and a female named Janelle Reed. Jeremy was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But even behind bars, his name never stopped haunting Leland's case, because rumors began to swirl. Whispers tying Jeremy, Ross, and another individual to a murder back in 2000. Allegedly, that was Leland's murder. By 2005, now he's serving time for the ultimate violent crime, this time a murder in South Carolina. The pattern is impossible to ignore: violence, desperation, recklessness, and it gets worse. Jeremy wasn't even supposed to be free when James Young was killed. A massive screw-up led to his premature release from Muskingum County Jail in February of 2005. They blamed a paperwork error that let him post bail and walk out, even though he was supposed to stay locked up for a parole violation. That mistake didn't go unnoticed. It made headlines, putting a spotlight on both Jeremy and Muskingum County. Jeremy's violent history, his name rumored to be connected to Leland's murder, make it impossible to dismiss his potential involvement. For 2 decades, Jeremy's name has lingered in the shadows of this case. Could those whispers, the ones linking him to Leland's murder, could they hold any truth? Let's talk about our fourth and last person of interest, Ross Swelling, a name that keeps surfacing in connection with troubling events, unanswered questions, and an unsettling pattern of being extremely irresponsible. Now, Ross is the son of the late Judge Butch Swelling, a man who was highly respected by many in Zanesville. Now, you'd think that growing up in a household centered around law and order might have set Ross on the straight path, but it didn't. From an early age, Ross found himself on the wrong side of the law. Weapon charges, drugs, falsification, all by 17 years old. His record was already a flashing red light. Now let's fast forward to 2005, where Ross's anger and impulsiveness came to a head. Imagine this. Ross believes a man owes him $20, just $20. But instead of brushing it off or whatever, he snaps. He follows the guy's car, forces it to stop, storms up to the driver, and shoves a gun in his face, demanding the money. A gun. Over $20. If Ross was willing to escalate to something so minor, to that level of violence, what could he do when $50,000 was at stake? The charge was serious. I mean, he was looking at aggravated menacing and having a weapon under disability. But the punishment? 5 years. That's it. Just 5 years. And the same year, 2005, his name comes up in that South Carolina murder we talked about earlier. In that case, Jeremy McGilton pulled the trigger, a senseless killing over a laptop. But Ross was only charged as an accessory, accused of helping to cover it up. And once again, Ross dodged severe consequences. While Jeremy served nearly 20 years, Ross somehow escaped any significant punishment. Was it his family connections? I think probably. Or was it just another stroke of luck for him? Because he seemed like he had himself an endless supply of luck. Now, let's bring back this Leland murder. Could Ross have been involved? Did his chaotic, destructive path cross with Leland's in the worst possible way? Or is his name tied to this case just simply because of his history and reputation? Well, here's what we know. Ross's name is linked to 4 murdered people. A young woman killed in a car accident in Linden Avenue, where Ross allegedly switched seats with his girlfriend to avoid responsibility. The South Carolina murder with Jeremy, the Leiland Cannon case, and his new current charge, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, this isn't about jumping into conclusions, folks. It's about looking at those patterns. Ross's story is one of privilege, unchecked behavior, and a trail of people whose lives were cut short. Those are the facts. How many chances does one person get before the truth finally catches up with them? And now, with his father no longer around to shield him, will Ross finally face the full consequences of his actions? Well, only time will tell. Ross Swelling may not have been the sharpest when it came to carrying out his crimes, but one thing's clear. He knew how to manipulate people to serve his own purpose. So years ago, allegedly, Ross approached Dan Holcroft, that's Leland's son, claiming to have information about his father's murderer. The two met in the wine rack parking lot, where Ross allegedly handed Dan a folder. But this wasn't just any folder. It was filled with incriminating details about Jeremy McGilton. Allegedly, inside were Jeremy's mugshot, South Carolina prison records, a detailed rap sheet, information on fights, cell phone usage, and even his release date. Now, you gotta wonder, did Ross gather all this information on his own, or did someone give him a hand? When Dan asked Ross why he was sharing all this, Ross handed him a phone with the text messages allegedly sent by Jeremy. And Jeremy, yes, was inside the prison, and he was using a burner phone. The messages didn't name Leland directly, but mentioned taking care of that old man, and included threats aimed at Ross for stopping the flow of money on Jeremy's prison commissary. Now, Dan believes Ross was setting him up, manipulating him into confronting, or even worse, taking out Jeremy. And at the time, Dan admits he was angry enough to consider it. Was that Ross's endgame all along? Get Dan to do his dirty work and just eliminate Jeremy for good? I mean, it's a question that sticks in my mind. Real talk, folks. Real talk. Okay, then there's Dan, and then there's Paul Dill, another name that's connected to Ross and Jeremy. Dan's son spoke with Paul at the Lighthouse bar, where Paul allegedly admitted he had been the driver one night when Ross and Jeremy talked about robbing an old man. Paul claimed he got cold feet and asked to be let out of the car before anything happened. But when Dan brought this information to the police, Paul allegedly denied ever saying anything. Now, that kind of flip-flopping only hurts the investigation, and it adds another layer of dead leads. But at the time of Leland's murder, Ross and Jeremy weren't just petty criminals. They were fully entrenched in a life of violence and theft. They had already proven they were willing to cross lines most wouldn't. Now think about this. 2 men with histories of brutality and a shared appetite for crime, suddenly aware of a briefcase holding $50,000. Could their dangerous partnership have escalated into a robbery and a murder of Leland? It's hard not to wonder if their paths led straight to that TV room on Exline Avenue. Now, fast forward to today, and both Jeremy McGilton and Ross Swelling find themselves back behind bars, facing serious charges once again. Jeremy is in the Muskingum County Jail on parole violation and facing new, very disturbing charges for pandering explicit child material. Now, men with charges like this, they don't have a very good time in prison. But let's remember, he's innocent until proven guilty. Ross is also locked up in the Muskingum County Jail. He's awaiting trial for a murder charge related to supplying drugs that caused a fatal overdose here in Zanesville. And like Jeremy, Ross is innocent until proven guilty. But both men are now staring down the possibility of long prison sentences if convicted. But here's where it gets interesting. What could this all mean for Leland's case? With both Jeremy and Ross in custody, there's a unique opportunity for law enforcement to revisit this 25-year-old mystery. Pressure has a way of loosening lips, especially when the stakes are this high. Could their current legal troubles provide the leverage investigators need to finally get answers about Leland's murder? We all know the golden rule. We all know it. Whoever talks first gets the sweetest deal. Will either of them crack under the weight of the crimes, or will they hold tight to their silence, hoping to dodge accountability once again? Well, only time will tell, but this feels like a moment we need to watch closely. Leland's story isn't just a crime. It's a wound that's never healed. A man who lived his life helping others, whose home was a symbol of safety and kindness, was taken from his family and his community in the most senseless ways. The investigation is a maze of twists and turns. It's full of questions that refuse to be answered and characters who cast dark shadows over this case. Jeremy McGilton and Ross Welling stand out. Their histories of violence and crimes paint a picture of two lives tangled in chaos and desperation. And then there's the driver. Out of respect, I won't share their identity here, but their role in this story is another thread we can't ignore. For almost 25 years, Leland's family has lived in the shadow of this tragedy. They've carried the weight of his loss, the questions that remain unanswered, and the hope that one day justice will prevail. As we wrap up this episode, I want to remind you folks, I'm not a professional of any kind. I gather very public information, and I present it to you for you to come to your own conclusions. So here we are, folks. We are left with one undeniable truth. Someone out there knows what happened to Leland, and it's time for the truth to come to light. People have passed away, others are locked behind bars, and the rest, well, they just don't matter anymore. What matters now is it's time. It's time to stop being afraid, to stop hesitating, and to speak up. If you believe that cold cases deserve attention, speak up. Whether it's by sharing his story, pushing for resources, or reaching out with information, your voice matters. Folks, cold cases aren't forgotten. They're just waiting to be solved.